We're going over the proofs for the inspiration of the Bible, for the Bible's legitimacy as a work from God that is profitable for spiritual health and moral maturity. Unfortunately, unlike the proofs for the existence of God, there is not just a neat 3 little proofs that you can draw from. Instead, there are several different proofs that show that the Bible could only be from God, but unfortunately they can't be so neatly packaged as before. But we'll be going over these one at a time, just as we did with the arguments for the existence of God. Now we're going to be going over the inerrancy of the Bible as proof for its inspiration. That's all coming up on this episode of The Gospel Call, brought to you by the Purcellville Church of Christ. Now, when we talk about the inspiration of the Bible, we're not using the term inspiration as our most common modern use of it. Normally, when someone mentions inspiration, they usually talk about an idea that came from some sort of observation of something else, right? The mountains inspired me to paint this picture of the mountains, which is a rather boring inspiration. It's just the first thing that came to my mind. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about the inspiration of the Bible. The inspiration of the Bible indicates that although the Bible was written by the hand of man, it came from the mind of God, as the Bible itself says. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. So, although the Bible itself did not physically come from God, it's not as if somebody was just sitting by themselves one day and then all of a sudden a Bible fell down from the heavens in a holy light and landed right in their lap. That's not how it happened. It was written physically by men, but they were moved by God to write what they wrote. You might think of the biblical writers as more of a secretary position rather than an author's position. They were the ones who did the physical writing, but they were almost dictated by God. Now, we say almost because there's actually a couple of complications that go along with that. Occasionally, the writer's own personality shines through in the scriptures. But it is so clearly guided by God through the entire way. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the inspiration of the scriptures and how this is opposed to other works that claim to be from God. When you see other works, they're not going to have some of the qualities that we're going to be talking about. Namely, today we're going to be talking about biblical inerrancy. Well, what is biblical inerrancy? The idea of biblical inerrancy is dealing with the fact that the Bible does not say anything that is wrong. It does not say anything that contradicts the natural world around us. It doesn't say anything that contradicts itself. It doesn't say anything that contradicts metaphysical philosophy. And it doesn't say anything that contradicts ethical philosophy. Now, of course, we recognize that every single one of those assertions I just made are often challenged. That's why we'd like to look at those just a little bit deeper. Consider the idea that the Bible is a book which lacks contradiction. There are certainly no lack of alleged contradictions in the Bible. And while time doesn't permit us to go through each and every single one of them, partially I say time, and then the other thing is, of course, I don't know every single contradiction that someone could come up with that might be a contradiction in the Bible. But what we're going to do is deal with some of the alleged contradictions, some of the more famous ones, and then we're also going to deal with a principle or two that really help us to discern some of the contradictions and see if they don't have a few answers to them. I'd venture a guess and say that most people who claim that the Bible is full of contradictions don't actually know where those contradictions are. Of course, sometimes they have an idea. One of the most famous ones, for example, involves the death of Judas, the apostle. One of the gospel accounts, and of course the gospels in the Bible are 4 separate accounts of essentially the same events, and so alleged contradictions in the Bible often come from here because they're dealing with the same events, and someone might say, look, this writer said one thing happened, but another writer said something happened entirely different. In the case of Judas, one of the Gospels mentions his death as he went out and hung himself on a tree, where another one of the Gospels mentions that he went out and threw himself off a cliff and that he fell down onto the rocks below, and that's how he died. So someone might say, look, there's a contradiction. One says he hung, and one says that he fell off a cliff. Which one was it? Well, we can't tell you with certainty what the answer to this alleged contradiction is. Why is that? Well, I wasn't there. I don't know precisely how it went down, and I don't know how these two things could possibly work together for certain. However, I can come up with theories as to how it would possibly work. And if I can show that there's a possibility that this does not contradict, then we can't say that this is a contradiction. It just looks like a contradiction, but really it's only a difficulty. We can only say that it's a contradiction if it cannot possibly coincide. So can these two things coincide? Well, certainly. Is it not possible, for example, that Judas would go out and hang himself on a poor rope so that quickly after he perished by hanging, the rope snapped and he fell off a nearby cliff that the tree might have been near? I'm not saying for certain that's what happened, but we can't deny that that's a possibility. And if we have a possibility, we cannot say that there is a contradiction. If you have a contradiction, you must know that two things here are 100% incompatible. Now, that's just one example of an alleged contradiction. There are, of course, many others. For example, was Jesus going into Jericho or coming out of Jericho when he healed blind Bartimaeus? One of the gospel accounts mentions that he's going in, and another mentions he's coming out. And there are a few solutions to this one, as long as there's a potential solution. Once again, we cannot say that this is a contradiction. One of the famous solutions to this is that it could have been that Jesus was coming out of old Jericho and going in to new Jericho, both of which would have just been called Jericho. Now, that's a possibility, certainly, although I don't personally think that one is the case. In my personal opinion, I think that this is actually two different events. If you look into the account of blind Bartimaeus, one of the gospel accounts doesn't actually mention him by name. We just assume that it's the same person because he says the same thing. Have mercy on me, son of David. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same person. Can two different people say the same thing? I think certainly that could be the case. I think that Jesus healed two people, one person going into Jericho and another person coming out of Jericho, who happened to say the same thing. Now you wonder why it was the same thing. I think maybe the second person had heard what had worked for the one and said, well, that's what the first person said. I'll say the same thing and then be healed of my blindness. That's my personal theory. Of course, I can't prove it, but what we have proven is that there is a possibility that this does not contradict. If we're going to say that there is a contradiction, it can't just be, well, maybe this is a contradiction. It really has to be a contradiction. And we can't find that in the Bible. And that's the principle I mentioned before, by the way, is that if we can show that there is a possibility that two things don't contradict, then we can't say this is a contradiction. It has to be proven to be a contradiction. Now, in a work of man, that should be easy enough. Sure, there'd be plenty of places that look like contradictions in a work of man that's as complex as the Bible. But then there would also be these places where it'd be proof positive a contradiction, not even a shadow of doubt as to whether or not this contradicts. But you can't find an example of that in the Bible. A couple of other principles that are really handy when it comes to determining whether or not there's a contradiction in the Bible. One, consider the context. A lot of the alleged contradictions of the Bible are found in the context. A lot of them will simply answer themselves if you read just a few verses after or a few verses before. Not all of the contradictions, of course. And once again, I should emphasize the word alleged contradictions. But several of them are simply going to be understood in context. As far as moral contradictions may go, there are a few things that are also important to consider. A lot of people, for example, look to the actions of some of the people in the Bible and say that that is a moral contradiction of the Bible. For example, David taking the wife of Uriah the Hittite and then essentially murdering him so that he wouldn't be found. People say, look, this is David doing something evil, but we have to ask the question, did he do something evil that was on behalf of God? And there are a lot of these alleged contradictions, particularly ethical contradictions, that are answered in the simple fact that just because it happens in the Bible, even if a God-approved person will be doing something in the Bible that is wicked, it doesn't mean God approves of it. There are a lot of God-approved people who are still found ethically wanting. In fact, everybody who God approves of in the Bible, with of course the exception of Jesus, which he himself being deity doesn't really count, I would say, everybody else, despite having God's approval, still fell short every once in a while. Just because David sinned doesn't mean God approved of it. He approved of David, but he didn't approve of that sin, nor did he approve of any other sin. Now, those are just a couple of principles that are important to consider. It's certainly not exhaustive. But I hope I've shown, at least, the important principles involved in showing that the Bible is without contradiction. Of course, there are a great deal of the alleged contradictions that we didn't cover. I mean, you can fill books up with this. In fact, people have filled books up with alleged contradictions in the Bible and having answers for every single one of them, and they still haven't done an exhaustive job because, of course, we can't possibly answer every single alleged contradiction. I've only answered 2 of them here. But that doesn't mean that the other ones are then legitimate. Perhaps I've answered a question you've had about an alleged contradiction. Or perhaps there is another alleged contradiction that you thought I ought to have talked about and you had questions about. First of all, see if you can't apply a couple of those principles that we mentioned before and see if it doesn't solve the contradiction right there. It's not going to work every time. These are just general ideas. But when you apply those principles, you'll find that the list of contradictions shrinks to nothing. And if you still have some questions, of course, we're more than willing to talk about it. That's why we've set up our email address. That's thegospelcallpodcast@gmail.com. That's thegospelcallpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. If you have any questions about anything we've talked about today, if you think I should be a little more thorough with some of the contradictions we just sort of mentioned, or if you had a question about another difficulty in the scriptures, we want to talk about it. So please email us. We love to hear what you have to say. For the Purcellville Church of Christ, I'm DJ Kessinger. Thank you so much for listening.